ever-expanding canon of internet horror, few stories have managed to straddle the uneasy boundary between myth and plausible reality as powerfully as the Russian sleep experiment. Allegedly set in the late 1940s, the story describes a Soviet-era psychological experiment in which 5 political prisoners were sealed in an airtight chamber and exposed to a gas that eliminated the need for sleep. Over the course of 15 days, the subjects descended into madness, cannibalism, self-mutilation, and ultimately something worse, becoming entities no longer human, begging for sleep not to escape rest, but to evade whatever awaited them in unconsciousness. The tale ends with the chilling declaration from one survivor: "We are what you made us. We are the madness that lurks within you all." First appearing anonymously on a creepypasta forum in the early 2010s, the story has since been translated, dramatized, adapted into short films, and cited as if it were a declassified Soviet document. The disturbing imagery and clinical tone of the original narrative made it feel less like fiction and more like a piece of forgotten Cold War history accidentally unearthed from a KGB basement archive. Despite being widely debunked as fictional, the tale continues to circulate through digital subcultures, horror podcasts, and conspiracy forums with a kind of mythic durability. It refuses to die, and perhaps more unsettlingly, it refuses to feel entirely false. This video aims to dissect the Russian sleep experiment not merely as a viral internet tale, but as a modern folklore phenomenon born from Cold War paranoia, government distrust, and real scientific horror. We will trace the story's digital origins, examine its narrative anatomy, and explore its psychological themes grounded in real-world sleep deprivation studies, Cold War human experimentation, and covert Soviet biowarfare programs. Furthermore, we will present fabricated but convincing documents, logs, and classified details that show how such an experiment could have been not only possible, but plausible under the historical context of Stalinist secrecy and Soviet military obsession with the superhuman. At its core, the Russian sleep experiment speaks to an ancient terror wrapped in modern dress. That sleep, the most vulnerable human state, may also be a barrier holding back something unnatural. By approaching this subject as both fiction and speculative fact, this videp will attempt to understand why this particular tale continues to disturb and what truths might lie beneath its fabricated horrors. The horror is not just in the gas, the mutilation, or the madness. The horror is that we want to believe it might be true, and that somewhere in a frozen Soviet bunker, it may have already happened. The tale of the Russian sleep experiment first emerged in 2008, a product of the rapidly growing digital horror culture. The term creepypasta itself, derived from the combination of creepy and copypasta, internet slang for something copied and pasted across forums, began to define a new wave of internet-driven horror. These stories were shared in forums, blogs, and message boards, often anonymously, allowing for an organic spread of ideas that felt untraceable and therefore more real. The Russian sleep experiment is one of the most infamous of these digital legends, largely due to its unsettling premise and eerie plausibility. The story first appeared on the 4chan/x/ board in the form of a narrative titled The Russian Sleep Experiment, penned by an anonymous author who claimed to have stumbled upon a set of secret documents that described a brutal Soviet experiment during the Cold War. While the precise origins remain somewhat unclear, the narrative quickly garnered attention due to its chilling atmosphere, medical-sounding terminology, and the deliberate inclusion of Soviet-era details that lent the story an air of authenticity. In its original form, the Russian sleep experiment was presented as a true account, with the narrator describing the horrifying events of the experiment as though they were based on classified records discovered decades later. The plot centers around a group of Soviet political prisoners who are subjected to a sleep deprivation experiment in a sealed, windowless chamber. Over the course of several days, the prisoners, exposed to a gas that eliminates the need for sleep, begin to deteriorate both physically and mentally. The ultimate horror of the experiment, suspended between the realms of scientific study and diabolical cruelty, was the creation of entities that no longer resembled human beings, but became something other, something more monstrous, driven to madness by the deprivation of their most basic physiological need. The story's virality can be traced back to the formulaic elements it incorporated, elements that resonate deeply with both modern and historical fears. First, the story is rooted in Cold War paranoia, a time when global tensions and the fear of the unknown prompted widespread interest in secret government projects, particularly within the Soviet Union. The mysterious and classified nature of the experiment is key to its narrative power. The mere suggestion of a government conducting experiments of this nature seemed plausible given the real-world atrocities associated with the Cold War era, such as the MK-Ultra experiments by the CIA, which investigated mind control and behavioral manipulation through drug-induced sleep deprivation. This made the Russian sleep experiment feel dangerously close to something real, not simply a work of fiction. What set this story apart from other creepypastas, however, was its clinical tone. Unlike many internet horror stories that rely on supernatural entities or unexplained phenomena, the Russian sleep experiment employed language that mimicked scientific documentation, complete with official-sounding terminology, names of fictional Soviet scientists, and the illusion of declassified government files. The inclusion of medical jargon such as REM sleep, psychosis, neurological deterioration, and cerebral hemorrhage gave the narrative a documentary-style authenticity, making it feel more like an academic case study than a fictional tale. The cold, detached language used in the experiment's description, the meticulous detailing of the prisoner's suffering, was what truly set the tone of horror. It allowed the reader to picture the scene in clinical, almost sterile terms, thereby enhancing the chilling effect of the events that transpired. The story also reflects a modern cultural obsession with conspiracy theories and government secrecy. The idea that such an experiment could be hidden for decades, sealed away by an omnipotent government, tapped into the collective fear that there are dark truths buried beneath layers of official denials. Many who read the story felt it was more than just a horror tale. It was a glimpse into a sinister world of shadowy operations that could have taken place during the Cold War, a time when the line between scientific advancement and inhumane experimentation often blurred. This fear of the unknown is a powerful catalyst for the continued popularity of the Russian sleep experiment. What if it were real? Following its initial posting on 4chan, the Russian sleep experiment story rapidly spread across other internet forums, blogs, and horror websites, most notably Creepypasta Wiki, where it became a central fixture of the website's extensive catalog of horror stories. The more it was shared, the more it evolved. Additional details were added, from the names of the test subjects to the inclusion of declassified government documents that expanded the narrative's scope. Readers who stumbled upon the tale on forums such as Reddit or 4chan often participated in this collaborative storytelling, contributing new twists or ideas. Further developing the backstory, the story's community-driven evolution helped it take on a life of its own, and it wasn't long before its chilling premise found its way into popular culture. Over time, the Russian sleep experiment gained a cult following, with numerous adaptations and media created around it. Horror short films were produced, YouTube channels posted dramatic readings, and even video games were inspired by the narrative. Some of these adaptations further blurred the line between fiction and reality, with videos on YouTube presenting the experiment as an actual declassified event. This proliferation only reinforced the illusion that the story may have a kernel of truth, an element of horror rooted in the idea that the events depicted might just be too plausible. In summary, the origins of the Russian sleep experiment can be traced to a confluence of factors: the internet's ability to disseminate content rapidly, the inherent fear surrounding government secrecy, and the story's masterful use of realism through medical jargon and scientific details. What started as a simple creepypasta has become an enduring legend, woven into the fabric of modern horror culture. The anonymity of the original author, the evolution of the story across multiple platforms, and the chilling themes of sleep deprivation and human experimentation have helped the tale evolve into one of the most frightening and enduring internet myths of the digital age. The Russian sleep experiment is not just a work of horror fiction, but a chilling exploration of the human mind's fragility under extreme stress, particularly when deprived of sleep. Sleep is a vital biological process that governs much of our physiological and psychological well-being. To explore the psychological themes and scientific basis behind the experiment, we must first understand the role of sleep in maintaining mental health, the consequences of sleep deprivation, and the real-world studies that inspired the horrific events of the story. Sleep is a universal human need, essential for cognitive function, emotional regulation, memory consolidation, and physical health. The absence of sleep, even for short periods, can have devastating effects on mental functioning. In the Russian sleep experiment, the subjects are exposed to an airtight chamber with a gas that eliminates the need for sleep, effectively pushing their bodies and minds into a state of prolonged wakefulness. While the story is fictional, it echoes real psychological and scientific concerns surrounding the effects of sleep deprivation on the human mind. In Randy Gardner's famous sleep deprivation experiment in 1964, the record for the longest time a human has voluntarily stayed awake was set at 11 days. The study showed that after just 3 days of sleep deprivation, individuals began to experience severe cognitive impairments, such as memory lapses, difficulties concentrating, and mood swings. By day 4, participants began to exhibit hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme emotional distress. Gardner himself reported feeling a sense of dread and disconnection from reality. His ability to comprehend simple tasks was significantly impaired, and he experienced profound cognitive distortions. Much like the test subjects in the Russian sleep experiment, the hallucinations experienced in the Russian sleep experiment, subjects seeing grotesque figures, experiencing intense paranoia, and losing touch with reality, are rooted in well-documented phenomena. When the brain is deprived of sleep for an extended period, the cognitive disintegration sets in. The brain, starved of restorative rest, begins to produce distorted perceptions of reality. In the Russian sleep experiment, the prolonged wakefulness seems to push the subjects beyond the boundaries of sanity, creating monsters out of ordinary men. Their behaviors, cannibalism, self-mutilation, and complete loss of individuality, are exaggerated versions of the psychosis that results from extreme sleep deprivation. To understand why the prisoners in the Russian sleep experiment would go from coherent individuals to mindless, monstrous entities, we must look at the neurological functions that sleep supports. Sleep is not a passive activity. It plays an active role in the consolidation of memories and the processing of emotions. The brain undergoes several stages during sleep, with REM, rapid eye movement, sleep being especially important for memory retention and emotional regulation. During REM sleep, the brain organizes and consolidates memories, making connections between experiences, emotions, and learned information. It is during this phase that the brain processes the day's events, reinforcing synapses that help us remember important details. In the Russian sleep experiment, the lack of sleep disrupts the critical role that REM sleep plays in maintaining cognitive coherence, leaving the subjects vulnerable to emotional instability and memory fragmentation. As the experiment progresses and the subjects go without sleep for longer periods, their minds unravel. With each passing day, their capacity for reasoning, self-control, and morality diminishes. The test subjects begin to experience confabulation, a psychological condition in which the brain fills in gaps in memory with fabricated information, and severe cognitive fragmentation. Their increasing violence, disjointed behavior, and animalistic tendencies are not simply a result of psychological trauma. They are the result of a breakdown in the brain's ability to process information coherently. The premise of the Russian sleep experiment is framed by a Cold War-era military obsession with creating superhuman soldiers, individuals who could function without the need for rest, eliminating a critical vulnerability in combat situations. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States were deeply invested in exploring new ways to enhance the physical and mental performance of their soldiers. These projects often veered into ethically gray areas, with both nations conducting covert experiments in an attempt to discover a competitive edge over the other. The Soviet Union in particular was involved in numerous human experimentation programs, many of which remain shrouded in secrecy. The story of the Russian sleep experiment taps into these historical fears and conspiracies. The USSR was known for conducting experiments in an effort to control the mind, enhance human performance, and exploit sleep as a weapon of psychological warfare. The story of the Russian sleep experiment is plausible within this context, an outgrowth of real-world efforts to push the limits of human endurance through scientific manipulation. During the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA's MKUltra program, which is often cited in conspiracy theories, aimed to experiment with mind control and behavior modification techniques, often using sleep deprivation, hypnosis, and psychedelic drugs. This real-world context lends the Russian sleep experiment a layer of authenticity. The idea that the Soviet Union, motivated by similar objectives, could have conducted such an experiment seems within the realm of possibility, especially when considering the military paranoia that pervaded the Cold War era. In Russian sleep experiment, a gas is used to keep the subjects awake, a detail that seems straight out of science fiction. However, the use of gas or chemicals to induce specific states of consciousness is not entirely outlandish. In fact, the military interest in chemical agents during the Cold War was widely documented. While no specific gas has been proven to induce sleeplessness in humans, there are real-world analogs, substances like stimulants, for example, methamphetamines, or dopamine agonists, for example, modafinil, that can have similar effects on the brain's sleep-wake cycle. While there is no evidence of a Soviet-developed gas designed to prevent sleep, the concept of using chemicals to manipulate sleep patterns taps into a deep well of real concerns about biological warfare and chemical agents. The Duga radar system, a mysterious Soviet technology that emitted powerful electromagnetic radiation, is often cited as a potential link to the concept of creating a sleepless state. The gas in the Russian sleep experiment can be viewed as a symbolic representation of the toxic lengths to which some governments were willing to go in order to create perfect soldiers, free from the limitations of natural sleep. The Russian sleep experiment serves as a horrifying allegory for the fragility of the human mind under extreme stress, and its themes are grounded in real psychological phenomena. Sleep deprivation is a well-documented cause of psychological breakdown, and the story's portrayal of the subject's descent into madness is not purely fictional. It is rooted in scientific understanding of how the brain responds to such conditions. Furthermore, the context of Cold War experimentation brings the story into the realm of plausible conspiracy theory, tapping into a historical moment when the line between ethics and scientific exploration was often blurred. The Russian sleep experiment, despite its origins as an internet urban legend, takes on a life of its own through the creation of elaborate fictional documents that support its narrative, expanding the myth into something resembling a lost chapter of history. These so-called classified files have become a cornerstone of the story, providing both depth and authenticity to the legend. As the Russian sleep experiment gained traction on forums like 4chan and Creepypasta Wiki, the original narrative was supplemented with additional classified documents that purportedly corroborated the story's events. These files, often written in the style of official Soviet documents, were designed to provide proof that the experiment had actually occurred. These additions, while entirely fictional, added a layer of credibility to the already terrifying story, leading readers to believe that the tale might have a grain of truth hidden within it. The most infamous of these documents is the experiment log, which details the day-by-day breakdown of the events within the sealed chamber. The log is written in a sterile, clinical tone that mimics real scientific or military documents, providing a false sense of authenticity. The entries describe the progression of the experiment with chilling precision, tracking the physiological and psychological deterioration of the test subjects as they were deprived of sleep. In the fictional log, the experiment begins with a seemingly innocent premise: to observe the effects of sleep deprivation over a long period. However, as the experiment progresses, the logs document increasing desperation, fear, and horrific behavior. The first days of the experiment detail minor physical reactions, such as increased irritability and minor hallucinations. But by day 5, the prisoners begin to exhibit signs of extreme paranoia, withdrawal, and violent tendencies. The entries grow increasingly erratic as the subject's condition worsens, with references to the horrifying physical mutilations and grotesque behavioral changes that eventually transform them into monstrous, inhuman entities. The inclusion of photographs and drawings supposedly taken during the experiment adds another layer to the narrative's plausibility. These images often depict grotesque, disfigured figures and images of the test subjects in various stages of their deterioration. The inclusion of such evidence gives the impression that the Russian sleep experiment is not merely a story, but the documentation of an event that should have remained hidden. The Russian sleep experiment's eerie plausibility has given rise to a range of theories and speculations about the true nature of the experiment. While many of these ideas are purely speculative, They reveal deep anxieties surrounding human experimentation, the limits of science, and the potential for governments to conceal horrific secrets. Some of these theories are tied directly to real-world conspiracies and fears of covert Soviet research, while others are entirely fantastical extensions of the story's dark themes. One theory that has persisted since the Russian sleep experiment's inception involves the idea that the test subjects were not merely political prisoners, but were chosen for their genetic superiority, an attempt by the Soviet government to create superhumans who could function without the need for sleep. This theory draws on Cold War-era ideas of eugenics and the Soviet Union's interest in creating a perfect worker or soldier. According to this theory, the subjects of the experiment were believed to possess unique genetic traits that could potentially allow them to endure sleep deprivation without suffering the usual consequences. When they were subjected to the gas, however, the experiment went horribly wrong, and the subjects transformed into horrific entities that were both physically and mentally beyond human comprehension. Another prevalent theory ties the experiment to the Soviet Union's interest in biological and psychological warfare. In this theory, the Soviet government sought to develop new forms of weaponry that could incapacitate enemies without conventional violence. The Russian sleep experiment's gas, which allegedly eliminates the need for sleep, is hypothesized to be a weapon of psychological warfare. The idea is that by depriving soldiers or enemies of sleep, the Soviet Union could break their will, render them mentally unstable, and turn them into mindless puppets. This theory plays into the larger narrative of Cold War paranoia, where governments experimented with everything from chemical weapons to psychological manipulation to gain the upper hand. A more abstract theory suggests that the experiment was actually a form of attempted transcendence. The idea behind this theory is that the Soviet scientists conducting the experiment were not interested in simply creating sleep-deprived soldiers, but rather in exploring the limits of human consciousness. The test subjects were exposed to extreme conditions in an effort to push the human mind beyond its ordinary boundaries, to discover what lies beyond the physical and mental limitations of sleep. The transformation of the test subjects into monstrous beings, therefore, was not a failure of the experiment, but a result of opening a door to something darker and more otherworldly. One particularly terrifying aspect of the Russian sleep experiment that fuels these theories is the recurring theme of sleep as a portal to something more sinister. Sleep, in many cultures, has always been associated with vulnerability, a state where the mind is most susceptible to external influences. The idea that depriving a person of sleep could not only affect their mental health, but possibly open a door to something supernatural or monstrous, taps into a deep-seated fear of the unknown. As the myth surrounding the Russian sleep experiment grew, so did the creation of new documents that further cemented the illusion of authenticity. These include official reports, supposedly written by Soviet officials who were involved in the experiment. These reports describe the ethical dilemmas faced by the researchers, the moral implications of using political prisoners as test subjects, and the increasing realization that the experiment was doomed from the start. In these fictional documents, the researchers are depicted as struggling with the escalating horrors of the experiment, knowing that they were playing with forces far beyond their control. In one particularly eerie document, a Soviet official writes, "The subjects are no longer human. They exist in a state between life and death. Their screams echo in our minds, and we fear that we have unleashed something that cannot be contained." This document, along with others like it, introduces a meta-narrative in which the readers are drawn into the experiment's mystery, becoming unwitting witnesses to the horrors that occurred. The document suggests that the experiment was not only a failure, but that it revealed a truth that humanity was never meant to know, that the human mind is a fragile construct, vulnerable to the unknown forces that lie just beyond the veil of sleep. The Russian sleep experiment continues to haunt the digital landscape, largely due to the ever-expanding mythos built around it. The fictional documents, theories, and speculative ideas have transformed the story from a simple horror tale into an ongoing cultural phenomenon. The more that is added to the myth, the more it becomes a reflection of modern fears surrounding government secrecy, psychological manipulation, and the limits of scientific ethics. As we delve deeper into these invented classifications, the very nature of the story blurs. What began as a short creepypasta has evolved into a complex, layered narrative, one that transcends the digital space and invites us to ask unsettling questions about the nature of reality, sleep, and the human mind. The Russian sleep experiment, though entirely fictional, has left a profound imprint on the collective imagination. What began as a simple creepypasta story has evolved into an enduring mythos, capturing the attention of horror fans, conspiracy theorists, and casual readers alike. The impact of the story transcends its online origins, affecting popular culture, online communities, and even contributing to broader societal discussions about the limits of scientific experimentation and the ethics of government secrecy. The Russian sleep experiment fits into the broader genre of horror stories that are built on the foundations of real-world fears and anxieties. Much like other creepypasta stories, such as Slender Man or Smile Dog, the Russian sleep experiment taps into deep primal fears, the vulnerability of the human mind, the abuse of scientific power, and the potential consequences of tampering with the natural limits of the human body. The fear of sleep deprivation, though it has long been studied in scientific circles, is something that many people can intuitively understand, and the experiment plays on this universal fear. One of the most significant impacts of the Russian sleep experiment is its contribution to the found footage style of horror storytelling. The use of official documents, logs, and reports within the story mimics the narrative techniques popularized by films like The Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity. This documentary-like approach creates an illusion of authenticity, making the horror feel all the more real. The narrative structure, which presents the experiment's descent into madness in a clinical, detached manner, amplifies the terror by contrasting the horror with the cold objectivity of scientific research. This sense of realism has made the Russian sleep experiment a key part of internet horror culture, with its influence seen in other online narratives that blend fact with fiction to evoke terror. Additionally, the story's influence can be seen in modern horror films and television series that incorporate elements of psychological and scientific horror. Movies such as The Experiment, 2010, and The Manchurian Candidate, 1962, which explore themes of psychological manipulation and government control, echo the core ideas present in the Russian sleep experiment. The fear of being manipulated, experimented on, or turned into an unwitting subject of a larger conspiracy continues to resonate with audiences today. These themes are particularly relevant in an age of increasing government surveillance, unethical scientific experimentation, and conspiracy-laden internet forums. The psychological impact of the Russian sleep experiment is also significant. As the story evolves, it touches on real psychological conditions, such as sleep deprivation, psychosis, paranoia, and hallucinations. The narrative takes these conditions to extremes, portraying how sleep deprivation can strip away the mind's ability to process reality. For many readers, the story serves as a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the devastating effects of prolonged psychological stress. The idea that a person can lose their grip on reality through something as seemingly mundane as sleep deprivation taps into a deep existential fear, the fear of losing control over one's mind. For some, the story sparks a deep-seated anxiety about the limits of human endurance. Sleep, after all, is something most people take for granted. It's a necessity that is rarely questioned in daily life. Yet the story challenges that assumption. What happens when we can no longer sleep? When the mind is deprived of rest, can it still function normally? The horror of the Russian sleep experiment arises from the complete breakdown of the mind's ability to cope with the absence of sleep, leading to terrifying psychological consequences. Moreover, the horror of the story is amplified by the loss of identity experienced by the subjects of the experiment. As they deteriorate psychologically and physically, they no longer resemble their former selves. They become monsters, stripped of their humanity. This theme of identity dissolution resonates with the fear that one's sense of self can be eroded through external forces. This fear is particularly relevant in a world where technology, social media, and political systems have the power to manipulate and reshape individual identity. The Russian sleep experiment taps into that cultural anxiety, suggesting that the erosion of self may be a more immediate threat than anyone realizes. One of the most potent aspects of the Russian sleep experiment is its link to government conspiracy theories. The idea that a government, in this case the Soviet Union, would conduct secret experiments on its own citizens, pushing them beyond their physical and psychological limits, taps into real-world fears about government overreach and the abuse of scientific power. While the Russian sleep experiment is purely fictional, its setting during the Cold War period, a time known for covert operations and human experimentation, makes it feel eerily plausible. The USSR, with its history of secrecy and totalitarian control, becomes the perfect backdrop for a story about government-sanctioned horror. The story echoes real-life conspiracy theories about government experiments that took place during the Cold War, such as the MK-Ultra program, in which the CIA experimented with mind control techniques, including the use of LSD and other substances, on unwitting subjects. The idea that the government could use citizens as lab rats for experiments, whether related to mind control, sleep deprivation, or other forms of psychological manipulation, resonates deeply with those who are suspicious of governmental motives. The Russian sleep experiment feeds into a growing sense of paranoia that has become more prevalent in the digital age. The story's suggestion that the experiment is part of a larger, undisclosed agenda reflects contemporary fears about the loss of personal freedoms, mass surveillance, and the potential for large-scale manipulation. The narrative suggests that there are hidden truths in the world, truths that the government doesn't want us to know, and that exploring these truths could have dire consequences. The legacy of the Russian sleep experiment extends far beyond its original posting. As an internet-born urban legend, it has inspired countless adaptations, fan theories, and derivative works, including short films, video games, and even podcasts. These fan-created works continue to fuel the mythology surrounding the story, creating a shared cultural experience for horror fans across the globe. The viral nature of the story, particularly on platforms like Reddit and 4chan, has made it a part of the larger fabric of internet horror culture, influencing the development of other popular creepypasta stories and internet urban legends. Furthermore, the Russian sleep experiment has been used as a source of inspiration in discussions of ethics and scientific research, particularly in the realm of sleep studies and psychological experiments. The story's portrayal of extreme human experimentation raises important questions about the limits of science, the role of ethics in research, and the potential consequences of scientific progress without regard for human rights. In this way, the Russian sleep experiment continues to have a real-world impact, raising awareness about the importance of maintaining ethical standards in scientific practice. The Russian sleep experiment remains one of the most impactful and enduring horror stories of the digital age. It taps into primal fears about the human mind, the fragility of sleep, and the potential for government abuse, all while offering a chilling, fictional glimpse into a world where science and horror intersect. As an internet-born myth, it has influenced not only the horror genre, but also the larger conversation about the ethical boundaries of science, the risks of government experimentation, and the dangers of unchecked power. The Russian sleep experiment's dark legacy continues to haunt the collective imagination, serving as a reminder of the terrifying possibilities that lie beyond the veil of sleep.